welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to our presentation on surviving the holidays. I'm going to first introduce who's going to be speaking today. My name is EJ Hackett. I am a therapist here at Tanner Clinic. I provide individual, group, and family therapy for those struggling with either eating disorders, disordered eating, or relational trauma. I moved back to this area in early 2019 from Atlanta, Georgia, and there was a program director and a clinician at the Atlanta Center for Eating Disorders, which offered IOP and PHP care, as well as a little bit of outpatient. Prior to that, I was working at a facility that provided inpatient PHP and IOP, specifically for women struggling with either eating disorder or trauma history. I'm involved in IADEP, which is the International Association of Eating Disorder Professionals, both the Atlanta chapter and the Utah chapter here. I'm new to, of course, the Utah chapter, but I'm excited to get things going and get a little bit more resources and events here in northern Utah. Chelsea, you want to introduce yourself?
Yes. I'm Chelsea Barlow. I'm a licensed clinical social worker here in Davis County. I have been practicing for 11 years. 6 of those past years have been a private practice just through Aspire, just here in Layton. And I focus on, I have traditionally worked with adolescents and adults. I'm kind of shifting more towards the adult population and focusing on any over-control disorder, including eating disorders. I have 4 little ones, so I work part-time. I enjoy finding that balance. So I can introduce
Julie?
Well, it's funny, I got an email from my the Dietetic Association. I guess I've been a dietitian for 30 years. Gosh, I didn't realize how time flies. So I'm a registered dietitian. I'm also an exercise physiologist, and I live in Ogden, and I also teach at Weber State. We teach nutrition, my husband and I. He's also a professor there, but we don't let him talk to patients. And then I have been so excited to be able to work in this field. I am also an intuitive eating specialist, and so I'm just excited that EJ asked me to talk tonight, so I'm really happy to be here. So.
Great. All right, so the, student in me can't get beyond these learning objectives. So just so you know what we're going to expect today, I wanted to provide a little bit of background about eating disorders in case there's anybody here that hasn't had that education. But of course, then we're going to get into the grit of what you all are here for. We'll start with some tips for planning for the holidays for those of you that are struggling with an eating disorder or disordered eating. Then we'll get into some tips for family members. How do you support your loved one through this difficult time of the year? Of course, we're going to hear from Julie, the tips from, specifically to our nutrition needs. And then at the end, we're going to have a little bit more of an open discussion, part of which will include talking about what are some healthy versus unhealthy holiday traditions. All right, so first and foremost, I think it's important to remember that eating behavior is along a continuum. On one side, we have our intuitive eaters. These are our folks that eat when they're hungry, they stop when they're full, they don't use food to regulate their emotions, they exercise for the health or enjoyment of it, not to compensate for what they've eaten, and they generally have a positive body image. And of course, on the other end of the spectrum are folks that meet diagnostic criteria for an eating disorder. But in the middle, we have patterns that we conceptualize as disordered eating. Now, there's 2 things that I think is helpful to remember about the disordered eating part. And that is that just because someone is exhibiting these signs doesn't necessarily mean that they have an eating disorder, right? So we want to be careful and clear about that. Now, that doesn't mean, on the flip side, of course, that that's not problematic, right? Any of these disordered eating patterns are worth exploring, worth looking at. And if someone is struggling with any of these, it's worth talking with someone to figure out how can you change your relationship with food, exercise, and your body. Some other important things to remember about eating disorders is that they do not discriminate. They don't discriminate based on gender, race, ethnicity, or socioeconomic status. Also, they come in all shapes and sizes, right? So you cannot look at someone and know that they have an eating disorder. We have to ask, we have to evaluate, right? It's not something that is as easily observable, right? It's also important to remember that eating disorders are unfortunately on the rise, and they have been on the rise since the 1950s. So it's a big problem, and it's a problem that's not going away. So you may be asking, how big of a problem is it? Recent research suggests that 10% of the population in the United States suffer from some form of an eating disorder, right? That's a lot of people. That's more than those struggling from breast cancer, HIV, or schizophrenia combined, right? So I would venture to guess that everybody in this room knows more than one person that's struggling with an eating disorder. And the thing that's also alarming about this is that this doesn't even encompass the folks that are struggling with disordered eating and don't meet criteria for an eating disorder. It's a big, big problem. And Utah is no different, right? We do not have this perfect little mini society that doesn't struggle with these issues. There are a lot of folks struggling, needing help and support in this area. So that's a part of why we decided to try to increase events in this area so we can try to help folks get the support that they need and deserve. I'm not going to talk about this one just for the effort of time, but I think this slide kind of encompasses the idea of what I wanted to talk about on that other side. If you're curious about that, you have it on your handouts there. But eating disorders are created in this perfect storm, right? Of course, there's a genetic predisposition, right? If we have a family history, then that shows that we are much more likely to develop an eating disorder. But that's not the only thing that leads to development of an eating disorder. The crude expression that we have in the field is that genetics loads the gun and the environment pulls the trigger, right? So things such as temperament, if someone experiences a trauma or bullying specific, of course, weight-related bullying, but not necessarily, right? Family environment, environment at school, having low self-esteem, life changes, right? That's a big part of our lives where eating disorders may develop. And that's why we see eating disorders start in adolescence. There's the hormonal component, which of course we don't have time to get into today, but any time that we have hormonal shifts in our body, then that can lead to a risk for developing an eating disorder, but also life changes. Going to college, getting married, having a baby, kids leaving the home, right? These are all periods of time where we may be at more risk for either developing an eating disorder or an eating disorder resurging. And for those of us that don't struggle with disordered eating or an eating disorder, we always have to be mindful about what messages we're perpetuating, right? Because of that genetic piece has to be matched with our environment. We have to remember that the best known environmental contributor to the development of an eating disorder is the socio-cultural idealization of fitness, which is just a fancy way of saying diet culture, right? So
The same what?
it's a fancy way of saying diet culture, right? So diet culture, the idea that being thin is the only way or best way for us to be happy and live our best lives. The more that we perpetuate this idea, then the more that we are putting folks at risk for developing an eating disorder. And we see this, right? There's some really disturbing statistics out there, right? By age 6, girls are starting to express concern about their weight. 6, right? 81% of 10-year-olds are more afraid of being fat than getting cancer, right? That one I think is particularly disturbing. And then of course, by the time that our kids are teenagers, 50% of girls and a third of boys are engaging in some unhealthy weight management strategy, right? So it is a big, big problem, and kids are susceptible at it from a very young age.
So where do you draw the line as far as, the U.S. population is heavier than any other population in the world, and especially our youth. So how do you talk about, healthy topics and being a good weight and eating healthy foods and those kind of things without perpetuating the lie that, thin is the only way that's in?
Sure. It's an excellent question. I think that we want to be trying to focus more on that intuitive eating model, right? I mean, if we are eating when we're hungry and we're stopping when we're full, then we're more likely to stay in a healthy range. Also, I think it's important to remember that our weight is not the only indicator of health, right? We want to make sure, how fit are we? How able are we to move our body? What are our lab work look like? So there's lots of markers other than just our weight that can indicate health, and we want to try to be focusing on that. And of course, a healthy relationship with food. Right? And I usually encourage folks to follow or ultimately get to the point of intuitive eating. All right, I don't want to vilify the media, but that is, of course, a environmental contributor, and we have to be mindful of that. Of course, media is in response to our cultural values, but we have to remember we see a lot of advertisements every day, right? So we want to be kind of detectives in how are we viewing media around us and how are we interpreting it, right? So we all know, and we've heard it before, but maybe we forget, the people in the magazines, they don't even actually look like that because of airbrushing, right? Mm-hmm. And kids in particular, if you have little ones, please be talking about these images and how destructive they can be, right? They're not real. People don't look like this, right? They're airbrushed. All right, so enough background for now. Let's get into the reason why we're all here. Okay, some general tips for those of you that are struggling with disordered eating or an eating disorder. It's really important to keep structure in your appointments. Right? This is not the time of year to back out away from therapy or not seeing your dietitian, not going to your doctor. And part of how you manage that is don't overbook yourself. If you're getting to the point where you have so much going on in your social life that you're not able to make your appointments, then that's an indicator that you need to step it back on some of those social engagements. Your appointment with your dietitian and your therapist is your self-care, right? That's one critical way to help you get through the holidays. Also, we want to make sure that we're managing our expectations about the holidays, right? If we're thinking about past holidays, we might be anxious about, oh gosh, is this going to be the same way that it was last year? Am I going to have the same awkward, anxiety-provoking conversations? It may rob us from the joy of being able to be present in the moment and seeing how this year can be different. On the flip side of that too, if holidays used to be full of joy and maybe we're struggling this year and we're comparing between the two, it can lead to a lot of disappointment and again, robbing us from that opportunity of enjoying what is actually happening. Right? One of my favorite expressions with having to do with this theme is that comparison is the thief of all joy. There's no reason to compare. It's not ever helpful, right? And just because this holiday season is different doesn't mean that it's going to be bad, right? The other thing that I encourage folks to remember is that, there's this idea with the holidays that it's magic, that we are more jolly, there's more pep in our step, and it's just, a fun time of year. When in reality, we put a lot of pressure on ourselves with the holidays. And because of overspending or overcommitting ourselves, we may actually be more irritable. So that whole kind of idea of having a joyful persona might not be realistic or true, right? So, again, it doesn't have to be that way. If we're not overextending ourselves, then sure, we may be better able to enjoy the holidays. All right, so how do we have a symptom-free holiday? One, we want to reclaim and reframe the meaning of the holidays. Human beings are highly ritualistic creatures, and I think that can be really helpful in getting through this season, right? Because we can get so caught up in the hype and buzz. But the purpose of a ritual is to symbolically share an important event or relationship, right? When we get too caught up in the buzz of it and we forget why we're actually getting together, then it loses its meaning and significance. And of course, it can feel more stressful than enjoyable. So why are you actually getting together with people? Why are you doing all of these extra things? Try to remind yourself of that. As an example, Thanksgiving is about appreciation. It's not about eating turkey and sleeping on the couch, right? We also want to try and focus in on our relationships, right? Human beings are social creatures, and that is the reason why we celebrate together, right? It's not about, all of these different things that we tell ourselves we have to do in order to have the holidays. It's about connection, it's about love, it's about being together with our family and friends. I encourage folks to create holiday traditions, if you don't already have them, that are focused on things other than food. Thank you to Chelsea for providing a list of, so caroling is an example, as well as crafts. Kiddos especially enjoy this, but adults too. any games or holiday movies.
But again, just anything that's focusing on relationship. The more that you can get back to that and try to distract away from food dominating the whole event, the better chance you will have at enjoying your experiences.
Can I ask you a question on that?
Mm-hmm.
So, that's great, but it's been my experience that almost every family activity that you participate in, or church activity, or youth activity, or whatever else, there's always food connected. So
Sure.
how do you, and like, for example, we have a tradition with our family that we've done for, I don't know, probably 15 years or more, that we do during Christmas time, and it's around having a meal in Bethlehem. And so it's like, so what do you, I mean, I get it, it isn't about the food, but we still connect it, and our memories, our memories inside, and all our rituals are partially affected and based upon the food that we have at those occasions. So how do you, in a realistic way, how do you start to change that, move that arrow?
Sure. So part of it can be making sure that you are including some activities that have absolutely nothing to do with food, like making room for creating new traditions and that being a part of it. But of course, there are going to be events where food is a part of it. But there's a big difference between there being food at an event and that being the center of the entire event, right? And of course, if you know that there is going to be an event, and we'll get into this a little bit later, or actually I think the next slide, planning on how are you going to handle that? How are you going to keep the focus and emphasis on the relationships, on the experience, as opposed to the food specifically, right? It doesn't mean that we ignore the fact that food is a part of things. It just means that we don't make it the focal point. Does that help?
Should. Easier said than done.
Huh?
Yeah.
Yes, it is. Of course it is. Of course, we want to allow ourselves a plan, right? If we are not going into a situation with a plan, we are setting ourselves up, right? Because when we're in those intense environments, the anxiety goes up, and when we are anxious or we're having other intense emotions, we're not making our best decisions, right? We can easily fall back into old patterns. And so if we have a plan and we're thinking about it ahead of time, we rehearse it ahead of time, then we're less likely to get caught up in that, and we're better able to, even in those moments of stress, act in the way that we hope that we're going to approach it, right? So things that we want to try to plan for is thinking about what do you want out of the holiday, right? What purpose will food play, right? So that's part of it, right? If you have an event with the family and there's a lot of tradition laden in it of, that food does play a big part, how much of it do you want for that particular event to be a part of it? Do maybe are you at a place in your recovery process that it's too much? So you kind of remove yourself from that piece of the event and you come back, making sure that you're, of course, meeting your nutritional needs. Or is there a way that you can work in those events within your meal plan, right? And of course, how do you handle your typical food challenges? Holidays are wrought with food challenges, so you need to anticipate as much as you can what are the challenges going to be and how are you going to handle them. Right, we're not going to be able to plan for everything, but the more that we're able to anticipate, then the easier it'll be. And of course, this isn't something that you have to do alone, right? Talk with your dietitian and your therapist, right? We have the benefit of having multiple years of trying to help folks get through the holidays, right? Use us. We can help you with defining reasonable goals and deciding what's best for you at this point in time based on where you are in your recovery process. And we want to be choosy about what events we're picking, right? We don't have to attend everything, right? And we want to pick the ones that are going to be the most enriching and rewarding for us. And of course, I want to imagine things going well, right? Yes, anticipate problems, but not at the expense of kind of thinking about, all right, what is this going to be like? How am I going to enjoy it if things go well? Right? Because that's the ultimate goal of having a plan, right? Is that you can still enjoy the event, that it's not as anxiety provoking as it would be if you didn't have a plan. Right? Part of any good plan is having support and accountability, right? So who are those people that you can share your goals with, right? That you feel that if they know, they can help remind you in a loving way and be there for you when you're needing a little bit of extra support, right? If they know that a particular event is going to be a little bit more stressful for you, Absolutely, letting them know ahead of time, right? But of course, you also want to focus on who are people that have similar goals to you and how can you bring them into your holiday experience? Who are the people that also want to focus on non-food events and holiday traditions? Who else wants to connect to the deeper meaning of the holiday as opposed to maybe the buzz or someone that gets caught up in all of the to-do lists as opposed to the significance of why we do those things? And who also wants to relax, right? Holidays have so much stress associated with them, even though it can be positive stress. Who are the folks that are happy to just kind of take a step back and sit and enjoy and not have the pressure of all of the things that we tell ourselves we're supposed to do? It also is a good idea to utilize your supports. Going to support groups, right? ANAD, as far as I know, please correct me if I'm wrong, does not have any live meetings here in the area, but they do have online meetings. All you have to do is go to their website and you can see the times and days that they offer those online supports. Now is a perfect time to be utilizing that support so that you can talk about, even if it's like in between sessions with your dietitian or therapist, you can talk about the anxiety of an event coming up, or you can process through afterwards how it went, right? So that you don't have to wait and hold on to that until the next session. And of course, don't isolate, right? When we're isolating, we kind of get in that monkey brain and our thoughts can go to places that are not helpful. And we want to be utilizing our supports, particularly this time of year. Part of our plan needs to include ways to contain symptoms. Right? One of the things that I encourage folks to think about and talk about with their therapist and their dietitian is, all right, maybe you've graduated to an intuitive eating meal plan, but because this is an extra stressful time of the year, maybe we need to switch back to mechanical eating, right? Maybe we need to make sure that we're eating 3 meals a day and 2 or 3 snacks, right? That might be the best way to help us get through this season and keep our health in mind, right? Or if you're at the point where you feel like, okay, I can manage intuitive eating at this point, we still want to plan, right? How many plates of appetizers are we going to allow ourselves? How are we going to ensure that we're utilizing those intuitive eating skills, such as chaining, right? Making sure that we're putting down our fork between bites. What's going to help us remember to do that, especially when we're distracted with conversation and buzz going on around us, right? We want to try to anticipate and review our goals ahead of time, right? It does us no good to talk about in session what we're going to do and then put that list and that plan away and never look at it again, right? Have to review and remind ourselves what we're trying to do. It can also be helpful not just around the holidays, but in general to have a food and feelings journal, right? And that can help us to identify what are the emotions that tend to disrupt our ability to eat intuitively. What are the emotions that maybe make us not as cued into our hunger? What are the emotions that make us not as attuned to our fullness, right? So that we can increase our insight, if nothing else, during this stressful time of year. Some folks I've worked with really like utilizing affirmations and inspirational readings, right? Especially if they're using them on a daily basis. So yes, this time of year can be more stressful, but if we're not seeking out ways to cultivate hope, it can feel pretty daunting, right? So even if we start our day with some way of looking at, okay, maybe there is a light at the end of the tunnel, then that can help add that little extra oomph to get us through that day, particularly if it's a specific event that we anticipate being stressful. And of course, checking in with our support system regularly, right? If we're inviting people in, it's not just enough to say, hey, can you help me out with this? And then let them kind of lead and guide on checking in with you. It is our responsibility, if we need support, to reach out and ask for it. And of course, relax, right? As much as possible. The holidays are not supposed to be stressful. They are, I get that, that's the reality. We have more things to do. But as much as possible, we want to try to create pockets of relaxation so that we're not constantly in that state of angst and wondering what's next. We also want to try to be flexible, right? As much as possible. Again, I'm not expecting magic here, but these are the things to try to remind ourselves. When are we being fair to ourselves? When are we not? Okay. And last but not least, regardless of how the holidays go, I think it's critical for us to always reflect back, of course non-judgmentally, Right? One of my favorite mentors introduced me to this expression. It's our capacity for change comes from our ability to reflect. Right? Regardless of how the holidays go, you can use it as a learning experience of what do you want to do differently next time. Also celebrating what went well, right? Because you can take that and bring that into your next party, your next holiday experience. You know, especially this time of year, we have multiple things going on. So if maybe Thanksgiving doesn't go so well, all right, well, what can you learn from that and bring that into the next one? All right, so switching gears to family members. Some general tips, and these are some tips that I have, or that I think are important, not just around the holidays, but year round. One, it's really important to remember that even though an eating disorder is a problem, it's also an attempted solution, right? So ask yourselves, what problem is my loved one trying to solve? And that can help you dig down and get underneath, all right, how can I actually help and support them, right? Because nobody chooses to have an eating disorder. Nobody wants to live with their head in the toilet. Nobody wants to live their life starving, right? It's an attempt to solve a problem. And if we can try to help them in figuring out another way to solve that problem, great. They may not need to utilize those behaviors to help. Also, of course, we want to be taking responsibility for ourselves, particularly if our loved one is an adult, right? Yes, we can provide support. Yes, we can provide accountability, but we also have to be making sure that we're focusing on ourselves. Of course, this is different for, those with kiddos, right? If you have a minor, of course, the parents has a little bit more responsibility for making sure that your child is taken care of, particularly if you're utilizing a family-based therapy approach. When you're expressing your concerns, which I do encourage doing that, because if we are not talking about things, if we are walking on eggshells, that doesn't help solve the problem at all, right? So we want to be open and honest, but we want to try to be mindful of how we're doing it, right? So speak from your own experience rather than what you think is going to be best for that person, right? Chelsea's going to get into a little bit more about what we mean on I statements, but that's one of the ways that we can try to focus in on our own experience as opposed to giving someone advice, right? Of course, we want to remain as authentic and present and empathetic as we possibly can. This is, expressing our love and hope is also important, right? Our loved ones sometimes forget that they are loved. They forget that they are worthy of love. So it is so important that we're reminding them of why they are important to us and why we want to keep them in our lives and why we want to be connected. Even though eating disorders are about the food, they're also not about the food. So engaging with your loved one on things that don't have anything to do with eating and weight, right? That is not the entirety of their identity, even though it may be taking up a lot of space and time in their life right now. It's not who they are. So reminding yourself to connect to that part of them that has nothing to do with eating or weight. Also getting support for yourself, right? That they have so many loved ones, that we spend so much time and energy and focus on our loved ones that maybe we're not practicing our own best self-care and getting our own support. The analogy that I like to use is if we think of ourselves as a pitcher of water and we're constantly pouring ourselves off into other people, right? If we're not engaging in adequate self-care, if we're not getting our own support, we're ultimately going to come up empty and we're not going to be able to provide the support that we want to, no matter how much we want to, right? So we have to get our own support. I wanted to talk a little bit about food policing, which of course is specifically to if your loved one is an adult. This is different if you have an adolescent, again, especially if you're following a family-based therapy model. And for teenagers and kids, of course, the parents are going to have a little bit more influence in possibly plating food and being involved in that process. But for adults, it's much different, right? I understand getting caught up in food because, again, eating disorders are about the food, but they're not, right? But anytime that we try to take over control of someone's behavior with food, that robs them of an opportunity for them to do it themselves and to learn, how do I manage this? How do I get through this process? So we want to have our loved one planning their food out with their dietitian, right? Yes, of course you can be providing accountability if you're explicitly asked. And if you're not, okay, there are other ways that you can reach out and support, right? If they're struggling with food, instead of getting into like what I think you should eat or what you shouldn't eat, ask them how they're feeling, right? What's going on? Because again, The eating disorder is an attempt to solve a problem. And if we can get behind what need is trying to be met, what the function of the behavior is, then we're better able to help them get through it. Okay? Also, of course, I wouldn't be doing justice to this topic if we didn't talk about the difference of enabling versus supporting. So I define enabling as accepting unacceptable behavior, protecting someone from the natural consequences of their actions, and doing something for someone that they can do for themselves. Now, this can get tricky, right? Especially because based on where your loved one is in their recovery process. Someone newly in recovery, they're probably going to need more support. They're probably going to, maybe it wouldn't be appropriate to go out to a buffet, right, at the beginning of the recovery process. But when someone has a little bit more time under the belt, they've had time to plan, well, not that, they might be better able to handle that, right? So talking with the treatment team as what's appropriate and helpful is key.
Could you maybe just give us an example of what you're meaning by that?
Which one?
Accepting unacceptable behavior.
Okay. So.
With regards to food and that thing. With regards to food.
Okay. So, gosh.
I have one.
Great.
Okay,
Thank you.
so I have had a client. So this wasn't an adult though. This was a kid.
Okay.
Is that right? Yeah. So where the child was, kind of again refusing to eat, and the mother was just going along with that, like not really trying to enforce food rules. So that would be kind of accepting behavior that we really need to not accept, right? I mean, is that
Yeah, no, thank you, absolutely. So any behavior that is, that could potentially hurt someone, right? I mean, if someone is continually restricting, they're not following their meal plan, they're continuing to lose weight, we can't accept that, right? So that might be an indicator that we have to have a conversation about increasing level of care, right? So that's what I mean by not accepting it. We just sort of kind of go along with it. And we increase our support and structure based on, any harmful behaviors that someone may be engaging in. Does that help? Okay. Thank you, Julie. All right. Enabling can also, like I mentioned a little bit before, it can also be about exerting control. Again, if we're trying to control someone's behavior, then that robs them of the opportunity of learning how do they do it themselves, right? That's not ultimately going to help them. It's kind of that, what's that expression? If I give someone a fish, then they eat for a day, versus if I teach them how to fish, then they eat for life, right? That's along those lines of what I mean by why controlling someone's behavior around food is not necessarily helpful, right? Okay. On the flip side of that, support is caring for someone rather than taking care of them. As a support person, especially, of an adult, your role is not to fix it. All right, that's their work. They need to work on what's going to help them through this process. But you can absolutely be there. You can listen. You can provide encouragement. Yes, you can engage in limit setting, right? In fact, I encourage it, right? We need to be honest about our own feelings and the impact of someone's behavior on us, right? But we're not taking responsibility for someone else's behavior, right? We're there for them. Does that make sense, the difference? Okay. All right, I'm going to hand things over to Chelsea.
This way.
Yeah, this way to move forward.
Okay, so still sticking with general tips for family that is helpful is validate. So validation is one of those skills that it's much easier said than done. Validating means that you just express to the other person that you understand where they're coming from based off of their position. So that doesn't mean that you agree with what they're doing. It just means that you are saying, hey, I see what you're experiencing. I see that you are really anxious right now. You're really struggling with this. That's so important to be able to support a loved one through their struggles with eating disorder. Validation is non-judgmental. It's remaining really neutral. Okay, so another tip is to just let your loved one know that you are there for them, to provide them support. So encourage discussion of feelings, as EJ already talked about, that it's it's not about the food, it's about what's going on with them. And trying to shift away from the focus of food can be really helpful. Radically accepting where your loved one is at in their treatment. That just means that you are fully accepting without judgment where they're at. As lovely as it would be, I'm sure, not to have a loved one be struggling with an eating disorder, sometimes that's just the reality, and coming to terms with that rather than fighting it or complaining about it or avoiding it is more helpful than not. Speaking in I statements, we will go over this a little bit more in depth in just a minute, but again, being able to express, I'm concerned because of this, rather than putting blame on your loved one and making it all their responsibility. That's just going to shut them down. Letting go of judgments or assumptions, and again, validate. So when each of you came in, there is a worksheet that looks like this, or a handout that looks like this. And at the top it says guidelines for relationship effectiveness of keeping the relationship. So this is what we call a type of therapy called DBT. This is a skill in DBT if you're familiar with it.
Are these all that light? This is really
They
light.
are, I'm sorry.
Okay.
So I will read through the bottom part, but what you really need to know is that top part, which hopefully you can read.
Okay.
So GIVE is an acronym. Each of the letters in GIVE stand for a specific skill that you can use with your loved one. So this is a really helpful skill to use when you are discussing tough topics, and discussing eating disorder topics are really, really challenging. It can be really difficult to let emotions kind of jump in and get in the way, and that is not helpful for anyone. So this is a guideline of some skills to use as you're having some of these discussions with a loved one. So, like I said, it's an acronym. The G stands for be gentle. So if you have a concern, make sure you're taking a gentle approach. Watch how you're coming out of the gate. That it's not this tone of voice is intense, or there's any type of blaming statements. Make sure you're being really gentle. I is for acting interested, making sure that you're not just focused on your agenda, but that you're interested in what they have to say and where they're coming from. V, again, is the validation. So saying, I understand from your position why you're experiencing this, or where you're coming from. Again, it doesn't mean that you agree with them, it just means that you're acknowledging them. When someone feels acknowledged, that can be very therapeutic for them and help them move forward. And the last one is use an easy manner. It can be so easy to, again, let difficult emotions get in the way and make things really tense. So smiling, using some humor if possible, just kind of lightening the environment and the mood can be really helpful. Okay, so the next tips we're going to talk about are holiday-specific tips for family members that have loved ones struggling with eating disorders. A lot of these kind of overlap with just the general tips, but I want to talk a little bit about some of these specifically that can help during the holidays. So the first one is remembering that eating disorders don't take the holiday off. We already kind of touched on this. That it's easy to want to just kind of join in the magic or join in the idea that, hey, this is a happy time of year, let's just kind of put this aside for a little while. But the fact is that it doesn't go away, and your loved one is still likely having a lot of anxiety and really struggling with some things. And so if they see, hey, we're just trying to put this out of the way and avoid it, then they may be less likely to reach out. And if you are their support system, then that's not helpful. In DBT, we talk about dialectic. A dialectic is two extremes being true at the same time. Sometimes as humans, we tend to be really black and white and think, if we have this hard thing going on and the eating disorder is hard, then we can't have fun and we can't have a lot of joy, and that's just going to taint everything. And that's really not true. The dialectic is having both of those extremes be true at the same time. We can have something really hard going on, something really sad, and still be able to find some joy in the middle of it. And so that is something that can be really helpful, and you can guide your loved one in doing this. This is something that you can set an example for them with this. EJ talked about getting busy, just thinking, hey, we'll just put off sessions or our seeing the dietitian or a doctor or a therapist until after the holidays are over because things are crazy. Don't do that. It's not helpful. If anything, this is the time that your loved one needs it. They need that structure, they need that plan to stay in place. Manage expectations. if you think you don't have expectations for the holidays, then slow down and think again, because we all do. Another word for expectation would be hopes or ideas. So just how you kind of think you want the holidays to go, we tend to attach to certain ideas. So that may be, we may attach to the idea of everyone's going to be there, everyone's going to come to this family party, where sometimes we may have loved ones, especially if they're struggling with the eating disorder, decide that's maybe not the best for them. And so to be able to accept that. So I would encourage you to take a few minutes to think about what are some of the expectations that I have around the holidays, and be able to adjust them and neutralize them, and be a little bit more flexible. And lastly, again, take care of yourself. Make sure you are attending to your own needs, that you, because this can be draining sometimes, that you make sure that you're addressing what do I need and addressing your own self-care. Okay, the second tip, helping your loved one create a plan, a coping plan ahead of time. So this is going to look a little different depending on if you are a loved one of a minor, so someone that you are caring for, versus a loved one of an adult. If you are a loved one of an adult, then it's important that they take the lead on their own recovery, that you don't step in, kind of like what EJ was saying, and enable. That you're not enabling or trying to take over something that is within their jurisdiction to take care of. But you can certainly let them know, I'm here to offer you support. I want to be a part of your support team with this. And so if they feel like you are a safe person, that they'll reach out to you. Now, if you are a loved one of a minor and you were caring for them, this is maybe going to look a little different. But still, I encourage you to talk with them about it, to have conversations, rather than just kind of jump in and do some of these things. Have some conversations. So some ideas are, maybe get a detailed plan of some of the events that you're going to go to. Because if they have an idea of what are we walking into, that can help reduce anxiety, rather than just, hey, we're walking into this to family, we don't know who's going to be there, we don't know what kind of activities are planned or what food will be there. Asking about the menu and the food that's being served, so they can kind of plan and prepare ahead of time. Understanding that your loved one, understanding their potential triggers and ways to navigate them. So knowing, do they have are there certain people in the family that tend to do certain things or can be very triggering for them, or are there certain foods that are triggering for them, and knowing what are some skills that maybe they've been working on, or some plans that they have in place, either that they worked with their dietitian or their therapist to navigate those. Coming up with a code word if they need to step out and take a breather or just check in, or having an escape plan. Those are a few things that can be helpful in preparing and making a plan ahead of time. Okay, another really important one is respecting your loved one's privacy. Now this goes for if you are a loved one of an adult or of a minor. It should not be any different. I know sometimes when we're around the holidays, we're meeting with friends and family that maybe we haven't seen for a long period of time, and we get in discussions with them, and we naturally want to talk to them about some of the things we're experiencing, some of the things that are going on in our lives, and maybe things that are going on within the family. And that can be really harmful. It's just important to remember that this is your loved one's information to share, not yours. And that also goes if you are caring for a child with an eating disorder. We know that family support is really, really important in recovery of eating disorders, and so it's important to keep that safe and trusting environment. And so if you share information that is not yours with a friend, a family member, and that becomes, we know kind of how that works, that goes down a telephone, then essentially your loved one has learned they are not a safe person for me to talk to, because they are going to just share whatever I share with them. If concerns come up with the loved one, discuss them in private, rather being right there, maybe in a big group of people. Don't bring it up right then and there. Again, have either a code word that you can step out and talk about, or just let them know you want to discuss in private. Some other things, you may have family members ask questions or say, hey, I'm really concerned about so-and-so, or make comments about maybe the food or the lack of food they're eating. And it's okay to redirect the conversation, or to say, thank you for your concern, however, we have everything managed that we need to take care of, or just to flat out say, that's just not my information to share, and if so-and-so wants to share information with you, then they will. It's okay to be direct. Okay. Avoid discussing eating habits, diets, body, anything like that. Your loved one is listening to what you're saying, and they're getting messages from that. So like we said, we know that social factors don't cause eating disorders, but they certainly contribute. And so examples of this would be things like, oh, I eat way too much. I guess I'm going to have to spend a lot of time at the gym tomorrow. Or you really shouldn't be eating ... Or you look amazing, tell me all your diet secrets or all of your gym secrets. Even statements like that seem really normal in our culture can be really triggering to someone that is recovering from an eating disorder. So if we're expecting our loved ones to develop a healthy relationship with their bodies and with food, then we also need to have those same expectations for ourselves.
So, what's the line between something that's negative or positive? I mean, for example, in April this year, I was more than 40 pounds heavier than I am now. And I've been working on it. I've been doing a lot of things to work on it. Changing in diet and changing exercise. So, I naturally talk about it to people and that I'm around, and they ask me about it because I look a lot different.
Absolutely.
So,
well,
how do you?
Ultimately, that's the culture we live in, right? Is that there's a lot of talk about that, and people are going to ask you, and it's tricky. It really is. But I would say if you have a loved one with an eating disorder, then you want to be really cautious. You want to be really cautious about that information, that especially when they're there, about what you're talking about and what you're sharing. And it's okay for you to say, that's just not something I'm able to discuss right now, because those are things that can be triggering. And it really is it's a shift. A lot when you have a loved one that's struggling with an eating disorder, you step into this whole new world of shifting how you think about food and health and exercise. And it's just something that oftentimes the family has to make shifts, because just little things like that can affect someone that's struggling with an eating disorder.
Even if it's just like exercising is good for you, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we all should exercise.
Yeah.
It's good for our bodies. Yeah. And he says diet, but it's mostly just, just making sure he's, well, I guess, think about it. I mean, it's not like he's restricting anything. He just is making sure he's not overindulging in things,
Right.
And so like any of that he couldn't share. I mean, I guess now I'm thinking about, that sounds like maybe that would be hard, but the exercise doesn't
something that
seem.
is tricky about eating disorders, usually individuals with eating disorders is oftentimes it can be really rigid, and so it's like they take things to an extreme. Okay, so exercise is healthy for me. And we may not see that maybe in the beginning phases, but that's usually what we see is kind of like the snowball effect. And so it's like, okay, I'm gonna exercise, and then they get some what they see as a positive result from that. And then they keep moving forward. And I'm not saying that exercise is a negative thing. What I'm saying is now you've entered this whole new world with a loved one with an eating disorder, that the way you talk about it and the way it's discussed, you just have to be more cautious. Okay, so it's okay to set boundaries. If there are people within the family or that are at these parties, or that you're talking to, are saying things that maybe are triggering to your loved ones, especially if you are a loved one of a minor with an eating disorder, it is okay to set those boundaries. Oftentimes it's more comfortable for the adults, like they probably know their sister or their mom a little bit better than this little, or I say little one, but probably a teenager feels comfortable saying something to their grandma or aunt or anyone who may make a comment. So it's just important to advocate for them. It just helps them know, hey, I'm on mom and dad or whoever it is on my team, and they're trying to help advocate and navigate these situations. With
So
me.
what does that mean? Can you share what that means?
Yeah, so like setting a boundary. So setting a boundary means essentially saying what is okay within your space. So maybe it's saying, I feel really uncomfortable when we're focusing so much about this diet that you're on. I'm really interested in talking more about what's going on with work with you. I'm just trying to ways to shift that and to say, hey, this is right now, based off of what we're going through, this isn't something that we're comfortable with discussing. And oftentimes we think if we set boundaries that's a mean and a bad thing, and it doesn't have to be. You can still do it out of love and respect. And you don't have to share information about what your loved one's going through. You don't have to say, hey, so-and-so is struggling with the eating disorder right now, so we can't talk about that. Finding a way just to say, can we shift this conversation, because this is, I would much rather hear about and talk about other things that are going on.
So, Chelsea,
Yes.
what do you think about, like, talking to the child that has eating disorder and ask them if they're okay with you sharing it with family, like their siblings, so that they can
Absolutely.
get their support and then they can know ahead of time not to talk about it.
Yes, as long as you're having that discussion with them and they're included and they feel like they can say either yes or no, absolutely. Not that it needs to be like this hush-hush thing. In fact, you prefer it not to be. You want them to be able to find the healthy supports where they can. And that doesn't mean everyone knowing, but it doesn't mean no one knowing. In fact, that actually can be more dangerous where if they are just keeping a lot in. So finding support where it's healthy, absolutely. And making sure, like if it's siblings, that you're also coaching siblings in some of these things on how to handle some of these situations. Okay, we talked a little bit about shifting focus of celebration away, not being so focused on food, and it being more towards a connection, a relationship, or some type of purpose, whether it's like Thanksgiving and having gratitude, or some type of spiritual purpose or service. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about that at the end. I'm going to share some ideas. Okay.
Okay. I'm just not having slides. Well, in case you can't tell, this is my handout with pictures on the back. So, actually, when you were talking about your meal in Bethlehem, I think that sounds kind of cool. So, I have to say, probably the holidays. I can give you an idea of my when I was younger and going through the holidays is what you don't want to do. I grew up on a farm in Kansas, and food was kind of a really big deal back then. And we made everything from scratch. We didn't have restaurants everywhere like we do now, and nobody ate out for Thanksgiving. Like we all made it from scratch. Well, my grandmother, she lived to be 100, so she was kind of really into her health, and and like I said, the food. So you guys, seriously, like holidays were awful. Like there was so much stress around the holidays because my grandmother's wanting to have this food being perfect, and then that filtered down to my mom, and my mom had a really hard time with that. So literally we had a salad, you guys, where we peeled the grapes. Oh. Peeled grapes. Who does that, right? Then we, made our stuffing from scratch, which, okay, that's fine. We had to get oysters for the stuffing. No wonder I didn't really like it when I was younger. And so my whole take home from that was, dang, I'm going to do it different. Like I do stovetop stuffing and instant mashed potatoes, and we're out playing, right? Like we are not, so centered around the stove, and being stressful. So I've really made sure that I give myself a break during the holidays. And so I think that's one kind of what we were talking about, not to just focus on the food like that. That was just a little bit overkill. But to really, have some other conversations and plan some other things, which we now did. So, and I also think, this handout talks a lot about, if the eating disorder patient is in a good place, I mean, if they can practice some of the parts of intuitive eating, there's something called taste hunger that we talk about where, maybe we're just gonna eat something to taste it, just to see what that's like. So we kind of help them around that. Maybe that's something that we would actually plan in, for them. Maybe that would be part of a challenge food for them. But we kind of plan that, maybe you're not gonna feel hunger or fullness from this, but this is something you wanna taste because it's the holidays and that's something that we can do. We also wanna make sure that, I think setting boundaries and how many of you guys are familiar with intuitive eating? Are you guys familiar? Yeah. So there is a book called Intuitive Eating, and within that book, there's 10 principles that they talk about, but one of them is setting boundaries. And I think, especially around the table, because, grandma's going to go, okay, you can have more. I made this just for you, right? Like, so there's those kind of things that we can set our boundaries with. And that can all be fine. You don't have to have seconds. I mean, that's going to be really triggering for somebody, right, with an eating disorder. So, so I think it is helpful if grandma can know that, or Aunt Betsy, or whatever, if they can really, it is nice to talk with the family if that's a comfortable thing to share. Because that was always, I think, kind of hard for a lot of my clients as well. And then I think, having that conversation too, and you guys have kind of alluded to this, but it was really funny this weekend. I got a text from one of my clients that was out of Stanford Change on a pass, and she's like, okay, somebody just said something about my weight. I don't know what to say. So I thought, we need to really have that ready to go. And, I was trying to be cute and think of something really good. But this person, I think, had said to them, oh my gosh, you look so great. How much weight have you gained? Seriously, like, they don't want to hear that, right? So I think just, having that conversation, weight is really triggering for me to talk about. We don't talk about weight, we just don't do that. So, having that, ready to go, because that is going to happen around the holidays. And then a lot of my clients are scared, like especially if they're traveling, right, and they haven't seen their relatives in a while. Maybe they're really thin, or maybe they're like more of a normal weight, or wherever they're at on the spectrum. And so there's all of that. So it's just like everything gets escalated, around the holidays. And I think, again, particularly when you're traveling, because then you've got to really find a space that you can be safe, with your food. Maybe there's food you need to get to take with you, or to make sure that you have. And I think that's where, too, just realizing people really don't care necessarily how you look, but, that they value you for you, and that it's not really, obviously, about the appearance. And I think, and EJ too, and Chelsea, so, I mean, really helping our clients, really make those plans. I think that is just really crucial during the holidays, that if we can help them, plan it to the detail, like, okay, here's what you're gonna have for your snack, and here's what you're gonna, here, and then your pumpkin pie can be your, your afternoon snack or your evening snack, and then that makes it kind of fit in okay. They kind of think, okay, my dessert can be my snack, that's great, like, that'll all work out. And that may be even better. The mechanical plan, like EJ had alluded to, that means we just have kind of a planned meal, like the planned amount, versus relying on intuitive eating. So when we have that intuitive eating, and it talks about hunger fullness is one of the principles of it. So it means to sound really dumb if you haven't really ever heard of this before, but it's, eating when you're hungry and stopping when you're comfortably full, not when you're stuffed. Because if people get to that full feeling, which often happens during the holidays, that's when things get really triggering. So I'll also have my clients make a plan, what happens when you get to that full, what does that feel like? You've just nourished your body, we're going to talk about that, but maybe there's something you can go do, and that's when you need to ask for help. So a lot of times it's maybe after the meal that they really do need that support and need that kind of help. And then I think this handout also talks kind of at the end about self-compassion, and hopefully we've kind of given that some sense of that to our patients, that compassion that it's common humanity. Everybody makes mistakes, and we all, people always make mistakes in eating all the time. We undereat or we overeat, and so it's okay. But let's just really kind of fall back to the meal plan, and I think that can really be their safety net. So I guess that's kind of my thing. However that plays out, if that needs to be a pre-plated session, we talk about that. I mean, we get really specific. Is that going to be pre-plated, or can you do it yourself? And what things do you really want on your plate? So those are kind of my thoughts on that. So. All right.
a little.
Oh, here, did you want me to go? Right
All
there?
right, so we all want to come
Oh,
up.
yeah,
This is
okay.
our discussion portion. Just to kind of, I have some ideas on here about maybe some healthy versus unhealthy holiday traditions. If you want to kind of look over those.
You didn't put
and-
peeling grapes on there.
No, I did not. I did
Now
not
you know,
I
now
would
you have a new one, peeling grapes.
would have.
Uh-huh, yeah.
But all right, so this side is maybe some ideas of unhealthy holiday traditions versus, the other side, some healthy ones. But beyond that, let's go through these first, and then we can, if you have any questions of like, maybe where does this fit? But first, okay, unhealthy. If we're skipping meals before or after a holiday meal, right? Sure, Thanksgiving, the tradition is that we load up our plate and we're it's kind of a scheduled overeating, if not binge eating holiday, right? So that's not particularly healthy, especially if someone is struggling with an eating disorder or disordered eating, right? We want to try to help them in making sure that they're able to incorporate the foods that they enjoy and they look forward to with the holidays. But again, that's where we might still bring in that more structured meal plan. I love what you said about like, okay, if you really love pumpkin pie, but maybe doesn't fit with a balanced meal, okay, that can be your evening snack, right? It can still fit in, but we're not trying to skip our meals or eat less, not listening to maybe what we physiologically need just to fit within the traditions of what our family typically does for the holidays. Of course, extreme overindulgence. That you don't want to be doing that as much as possible, right? Because that's a setup for feeling anxious later on, guilt, shame, a whole multitude of negative emotions that may kind of spiral us backwards as opposed to helping propel us forward. Overspending, right? That just is stressful. So even though we may have the pressure to overspend over the holidays, that we can set that boundary and not have that be a part of it, right? Because anything that we can do to reduce stress is going to help us over the holidays. And as we've talked about, I think ad nauseum at this point, we don't want to overextend ourselves. We want to really honor what is going to be best for me this holiday season. How can I make sure that I enjoy the moments that I do spend with people? And part of that is making sure that we're not overdoing it. And of course, on the flip side of that is eating regularly. That's important to do over the holidays. Listening to our hunger and fullness cues if we're following an intuitive eating model. Otherwise, if we're not to that point yet, we are following our meal plan and structure guided within our meal plan. And in general, moderation with all activities. You can do the things that you enjoy and love. We just want to make sure that we're scaling it back to the point that you're not overdoing it. All right, and we want to open it up to questions about, questions in general, but also specific to healthy and unhealthy.
When you say moderation in all activities, what are you really talking about in there? Is that mostly food, or are you talking about everything?
Everything.
And I think too, maybe the
I don't know if I
exercise,
agree
like
with that.
some,
Anyway,
like
Go
some
ahead.
patients can't exercise very much. Like we have to pull them back. Like they aren't able to go out and, do all the things they used to do. Like even skiing, like, some of them can't do that yet. Some of them sledding, well, I don't know. We really have to monitor their activity. I don't know if that's necessarily what you're talking about, but sometimes with that exercise, that's the other portion of that they have to really be monitored.
Sure.
So.
Yeah, and again, it's important to remember moderation doesn't mean not do it at all, right? It just means that maybe we're being more mindful of how much time are we spending on this. Gosh, if it's, again, that party environment, right? We want to be there, we want to spend time with our loved ones, but I'm sure we've all experienced that moment where we're like, I'm ready to go home.
Yeah.
But maybe we feel that pressure of I've got to stay, I didn't talk to so-and-so, am I going to offend the host if I leave? Trying to, as much as possible, pull away from that and really honoring, especially for your loved one. When it's too much, we listen to that and we go. And it's okay that maybe we didn't stay as long as we wanted to, or maybe that we don't do all of the activities, that we kind of pick and choose.
So you're saying that, so the moderation is to help them with their anxiety oftentimes, or their
Anxiety and
physical
self-care.
ability at that point?
Yes.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, yes, yep. With the physical exertion, we want to keep that, lower, we want to manage anxiety, and just general self-care, right? Again, we can get so caught up, especially in the holiday, with obligation, right? We always go to Nana's house. We have to go to Nana's house, even though we're going to Aunt Betsy's house and Uncle Frank's house before that, right? Well, maybe not. right? Maybe we can spread it out. We can still spend the holidays with them, but maybe this day we're going to see this person and this day we're going to see this other person. It doesn't have to be all crunched in on one day.
Really, really good.
He likes that point.
What would you like to do?
Any other
It's
thoughts?
every holiday is an Indianapolis 500. So.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, and I think too, again, when you travel and you have to go see everybody or whatever, maybe you just need to have one thing where everybody comes to you or whatever, but it can get out of hand. Yeah.
All right, any other comments, like things that you're not quite sure if it's a healthy versus unhealthy holiday tradition? Any anticipation for things that you're not sure how to manage? General questions about what we've talked about today? Now's your time.
Thanksgiving tends to be a holiday where people make a lot of comments about food or what people are eating or not eating. What's a good way to navigate that? Like all the comments about
Change the subject.
Huh?
Change the subject.
Right, yeah. I mean, it depends on your comfortability within the social setting, but I mean, people pick up on cues pretty quickly. Of like, if they're talking about this thing and then you say, so what about your, right? I mean, people get the message pretty quickly of like, or maybe they don't even know where it's coming from, but usually folks follow suit, and if it's about food, they're not gonna be like, wait, that's so important, we need to get back to it. It can be.
Or their diets, is that what you mean? Like, it's a really weird time to not be on a diet, right? I mean, with all the dieting culture, like she was talking about, everybody's on a different type of diet, it seems like. So could come up, right? So.
or like my grandpa likes to pay attention to what everybody eats or like you didn't get seconds on that, go back and get that, or you still have food on your plate, or like I don't just like seems like any family member can.
Is some good grandpa? Yeah, he's probably not gonna change.
Yeah,
He's not gonna change. Yeah. Sit far away from him. Maybe he can't see.
I don't know the answer to this. Just something I was thinking about is that it seems like, I grew up, that it's like you have some of everything and you eat everything on your plate.
Clean
Always.
plate club.
Always. And you have some of everything. And you're not leaving the dinner table until you've had some of everything. And so I think that's ingrained in me a little bit. And it's like my mom, for just this as an example, it's like she was always, she wanted you to have seconds. She spent all this time preparing the meal for you. And so she wants you to enjoy it. And she wants you to have, lots of it. And so it's like when you ask for a serving and she dish it up, it was like, tell me when to stop, and just stop, and then she'd go. And so I guess my, it's like what she was saying. It's like, Thanksgiving. It's like, I mean, everybody I know is on doing some weird kind of diet thing.
Mm-hmm.
They're on keto, or they're on Atkins, or they're on, who knows what, and then just Thanksgiving has become a day not of Thanksgiving, but it's Turkey Day. It's not Thanksgiving anymore,
And
and
that's
it's
exactly
watching
the point.
football. So it's like, I mean, this is like troublesome waters for
Yeah.
Well, yeah,
somebody that
that's-
has a eating disorder.
For sure, right? And that may be where we need to have some very real and honest conversations about how do we want to structure Thanksgiving this year, right? Depending on where your loved one is in their recovery process, maybe it's better to send our love and regards to our family members, and we're just doing a quiet Thanksgiving at home where we can ensure that we're focusing more on what we're grateful for, our blessings and time together, right? We can do that, right? We're push back. Right, and as a support person, then my encouragement for you, especially if someone's newer in the recovery process, the best thing you can do to be their support is to, as long as they're in agreement with it, that you take the brunt of that, of talking to family members of like, that's just doesn't fit with what we want to do this year. We want to have something simple, and it doesn't even have to get into the disordered eating or eating disorder. Just if that's just not going to work with our family this year, we miss you, we love you. No, right? But certainly, again,
just because things have always been that way doesn't mean that they can't change. Right? So I get that deeply ingrained kind of attitude of like, gosh, I'm going to have everything and I'm going to finish it all, right? But just because that's the way that we did in the past doesn't mean that we have to do that now. And it's really important for our loved ones to be planning out, all right, how do they manage that? If that is a kind of part of the family tradition, how do we work within that and the confines of their meal plan, right? So maybe it is that if they really enjoy having a little bit of everything, talking with their dietitian is like, okay, maybe we do a partial exchange of the mashed potatoes and a partial exchange of the sweet potatoes, to kind of make sure that we have a little bit of everything, and as a whole, it's meeting our meal plan structure, right? Trying to, fit within that. And if someone is following a meal plan, yeah, they may be making sure that they're eating everything on their plate because that's what they need to do to get the energy that they need and to heal their body, right? But if they're more intuitive eating, of course they may not finish everything on their plate. And that's part of where we would come in with planning. If we know and anticipate that somebody's going to be like, gosh, you didn't finish your mashed potatoes there, is there something wrong with them? Right? We're talking about how are we going to handle that?
Or you could also bring a plastic container and put it in there and say, I'm going to have this later, Grandpa. Thank you so much. Right? Like,
sure. Yeah. And having like an expression for how.
Yeah, if they want you to have seconds, like, well, here, let me just take it with me, and then I'll have it later.
Yeah. And remember,
That's actually a good way to go because then it's not like, not that I don't like the mashed potatoes.
Yeah,
I'm
right.
just kind of full, so I bet I'd like to take them with me.
Sure. Yeah, because remembering like what is the function of someone wanting to give you that food? Like they're wanting confirmation that you enjoyed it, right? Because that's part of the way that they give and express their love, right? Is to provide that food for you. So how can you reassure them? I've message received. This was wonderful, delicious. I love it. I just can't eat anymore right now. Any other questions? Yeah, for sure. It is dinner time. Past dinner time.
I was just going to make a comment that I think we all have people in our lives that are predictable. Like we kind of know what Aunt Stacy's going to say, or like what Grandma's going to comment on the food or comment on weight or something. So I think going into the holidays, if you've planned it and you've tried to have those conversations of if we can try to not have so many triggering topics such as weight, clothing sizes, body shapes,
Diets.
food, diets. Like once you've laid that foundation, but you still know that predictable person is still gonna probably drop some bombs, but knowing like ahead of time, like that's probably gonna happen. And like I'm just gonna try my best to like accept it. And how can I almost have like a Charlie Brown moment where it's like the teacher talking, where it's like, I'm not going to take this in because this is about Aunt Stacy. This isn't about me,
Just a comment, if you could comment on my comment. It sounds like too that, it's like anything else. If you planned in advance and anticipated some of the things that may happen, then when they happen, it's not like a surprise and it doesn't freak you out.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like, oh, okay, well, I knew this was going to happen, and so I'm just going to just try to do what we talked about, and then even if it doesn't work, it's just like it doesn't freak me out because I anticipated in advance that it was going to happen already.
Absolutely. Yeah, one of the things that I talk with folks that I work with about is awareness of our vulnerabilities. Right, and it may be so. Sure, triggers or conversations with stuff. Our relationship history with certain family members may be a vulnerability. Like, maybe Aunt Susie says something that really gets us going. That if somebody, like a coworker, said the same thing, it wouldn't have the same impact, right? But if we're aware of our vulnerabilities, then even if we're not able to change them, because we can't change other people's behavior, right? Directly. If they're willing, sure, we can ask them, but we can't absolutely change their behavior. But if we know that there's something coming, like you said, it kind of reduces the impact. It kind of doesn't catch us as off guard.
And it makes me think of Big Fat Greek Wedding.
Huh?
Makes me think of Big Fat Greek Wedding where he says that, he doesn't eat meat. She says, you don't eat meat? And like everybody stops and freezes, the whole family. They like freak
That's a good
out.
example.
And then she says, "Oh, okay, I'll make you lamb."
That's a good example.
That's a good example.
All right. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks, EJ.
Thank you.
Yeah.